So this is a theory I've had ever since I caught up, which happened to be at chapter 1044, which happened to be the chapter that gave me this theory. This is the oldest theory I've ever had about One Piece, and I still believe it 3 years later, and it's also kind of the theory that I'm the most confident in, despite the fact that I've rarely seen it discussed and never quite in the right way. And that is the idea that if the sun god Nika has a devil fruit, the other 3 gods have to as well. If you don't know what I mean, our first ever mention of the sun god in One Piece was by the Shandorans in Nolan's flashback, where he was mentioned alongside 3 others, those being the storm god, the forest god, and the earth god. Much later, in Elbaf, the Harley, Elbaf's record of the ancient past, so too mentions a sun god, an earth god, a forest god, and a sea god. Sea god, storm god, rain god, it's all the same thing. There's also Gadatsu's cover story, which features a boss of the earth, a boss of the forest, and a wannabe boss of the sea in Gadatsu himself. But I'm not done. Remember the mermaid quintuplets, you know, Ichika, Nika, Sanka, Yonka, and Yonka 2, like Nika as in sun god Nika? Now, the word Nika can be read into multiple ways, but the most important thing here is that the first part, ni, means 2. This perhaps implies that Nika is in some way the number 2 in a set of multiple gods, a set of 4, for example. Running with this idea, I think I can even work out which is which. Ichika would be the earth god, Nika is obviously the sun god, Sanka would be the rain/sea god, and Yonka would be the forest god. Why do I say this? Well, because it's the order in which each of those things, earth, sun, rain, and forest, would have first came into existence. First you would have the earth, as in the chunks of earth floating aimlessly through space, which would later form into the planet shape we know today, following the arrival of the sun. Secondly, you would have the sun spontaneously exploding onto the scene as the product of a bunch of hydrogen atoms undergoing nuclear fusion. Thirdly, you would have the rain/sea following the arrival of water to the planet Earth, and finally you would have had the forests, which you could only have come about because of the existence of the rain/sea. 1, 2, 3, 4, Ichi, Ni, San, Yon. Some people bring up Yonka 2 as evidence that there exists a secret 5th god, but I think it's the opposite. Aside from mostly just being a dumb gag, I think the inclusion of Yonka 2 is to show that there are only 4. If there was a Goka to name her after, Oda would have, but the rule is that they are all named after gods, and so, because there isn't a 5th god, she has to instead take the name of one of the others. With that said, let's talk about devil fruits. I believe Luffy's fruit is not a unique exception, but rather the first in a pattern of 4. If there's a mythical Zoan type human fruit for the sun god Nika that spent the majority of the series going under a different alias, then in my opinion that's likely to also be the case for each of the other 3. And furthermore, I believe we've already been introduced to those 3 other powers as well as their users in the story already. Let's start with the most obvious one. I believe Green Bull's Forest Logia is really the forest god fruit. I say this primarily because it's the forest power, but also because, well, Green Bull's power doesn't exactly seem like a Logia, does it? Every other Logia we've been introduced to, both before and since, is a substance, a thing. Fire, ice, magma, smoke, mud, clay, soot, light, dark, electricity, sand, etc. A wood Logia would fit, but forest? That's a whole ass biome. Much the same way Luffy's fruit never really fit the classification of a rubber paramecia, multiple villains would comment on how something Luffy did isn't something rubber can do, Luffy's explanation for Gear 3 being him sending air through his bones despite the fact that bones aren't connected, his random ability to produce flames underwater. These abilities don't exactly fit the description of rubber paramecia, but they do fit a sun god Zoan, whose powers would be a lot broader. Similarly, Green Bull's power doesn't exactly fit the classification of forest Logia, but a forest god Zoan, there's a lot more leeway. Moving on to Dragon, Storm God Fruit. I know some people say Dragon has like a wind Logia. Dragon has demonstrated wind powers, his ship's called Wind, he's often drawn with wind. However, A, a wind Logia would be fucking lame, and B, a Storm Fruit would encompass wind powers anyway. Dragon's powers not being limited to wind, but storms more broadly, would explain, well, the storm at Logtown, which was heavily implied to be unnatural, as well as the fact that the storm was specifically noted to have come from the east, which, you know, Dragon, east, as well as the lightning strike that saved Luffy. Some people put this up to fate, and that's obviously what you're meant to think at the time, but do we really expect the guy whose power I think everyone would agree has control over the weather in at least some form, who already used his weather powers to save Luffy once in that arc, to not have also been behind the other weather event that saved Luffy the other time that arc? Dragon having a storm power and not a wind power would also explain how he was able to put out the Grey Terminal wildfires. Wind on its own would only exacerbate a a wildfire like that, the nobles in the story explicitly talk about how the strong winds that day would help the fire, you'd have to use water to put it out, like in the form of rain. Here's a cover page of Dragon making it rain on some snails, the very next chapter in which the fire gets put out. There'd also just be a cool dynamic with every member of the monkey family who has a devil fruit both having god fruits, with Dragon's fruit giving him the power of lightning and Luffy's god fruit making him uniquely immune to lightning. Now, before I get into the earth god and its user, I want to address a potential criticism of this theory. If the sun god fruit doesn't grant its user the power of the sun, then why would the other god fruits, storm, forest, etc., grant their users the powers of those things directly? Well, I'd argue the Nika fruit actually does give its user the power of the sun. Think about what the sun is. It's a big ball of energy. Now, what happens when you give matter energy? The particles are gradually freed from their bonds, kinda like how Nika frees the enslaved from their bonds, and the overall substance becomes less solid, and potentially more malleable, more rubbery. Is it possible that the rubbery quality given to Luffy's body and now his surroundings following his awakening is actually just a result of them being imbued with the energy of the sun? Not enough to burn or melt anything, but just enough to become slightly less solid, thus, albeit in a very fantastical, pseudoscientific-y, one-piecey way, giving the effect of being a rubber power. If Luffy really does have the power of the sun in a more traditional sense, that could explain his flames, as well as him being completely immune to not just lightning but fire as well, which we saw in his fight with Big Mom. Fire and lightning are both just high concentrations of energy, so it would make sense for an energy man to be immune to them. I say all this now because, similarly to Luffy, I believe the Earth God Fruit's power isn't so directly the power of Earth like Dragon's is the power of storms or Green Bull's is the power of forests, and yet despite that, it's also the closest fit I believe we currently have out of any in the story to an Earth God power. I'm talking, of course, about the power formerly belonging to Whitebeard and currently belonging to Blackbeard, the Tremor fruit, the power of earthquakes. Think about it. What are earthquakes? Put simply, they're the vibrations that occur as a result of the Earth's inner mantle layer shifting about and causing the various tectonic plates that comprise the Earth's crust to bash together or scrape together or pull apart. In other words, if you have the power of earthquakes, what you really have is the power of Earth. Not Earth as in like soil, but the Earth. A power very much befitting of the god of the Earth. We discussed earlier how Luffy's and Green Bull's fruit powers don't cleanly fit the initial name and classification respectively that they were initially given. I said initially twice. And this is doubly true for the Tremor fruit, which seemingly just gives its user additional abilities, namely the ability to crack the air like glass, which, kinda like Luffy's Toon Force stuff, shouldn't be possible unless it's the power of a god, as well as this, like, force field power? Like, have you never found this odd? The only other example I can think of where it just completely goes outside the confines of the ostensible main power is Luffy's Sun God Fruit. I know it's One Piece, but there's normally at least some adherence to the logic of the ability. If not literally, then at least symbolically. Crocodile can absorb moisture because sand be dry. Doflamingo can control people because, you know, strings, marionettes, etc. Kaido's litany of abilities are all vaguely dragony. The fire shit is Western dragons, the lightning weather shit is Eastern dragons. Even Blackbeard's other devil fruit, the dark fruit, can do all the stuff black holes can do. That makes sense. But like, what the fuck is even going on here? Is this something earthquakes can do? I mean, this moment specifically, which we see later Whitebeard repeat in Roger's flashback, is a pretty clear example of how it's less so specifically an earthquake ability and more so a general control over the earth and its parts ability. And that's not even getting into how Blackbeard's Tremor fruit, being a god fruit, would intersect with Luffy and his fruit and how that would act as a perfect extension of their pre-existing dynamic. Luffy and Blackbeard are superficially very similar, but deep down, very different. Luffy loves free will and he loves taking the detours. Blackbeard shits on the idea of free will both through his actions and his love of the idea of fate, and he loves shortcuts, as seen through his haphazard ship, his haphazard crew, his love of devil fruits, and the overall path he's taken throughout the story. Likewise, under this theory, Luffy and Blackbeard would both be similar in that they'd both have god fruits. However, the key difference difference would come in that Luffy's god fruit requires that Luffy put an extensive amount of his own will and his own self into taking it from being virtually completely useless into being a genuinely powerful force, whereas Blackbeard's god fruit is basically the strongest devil fruit in the world right out the gate without him having to do anything. If you think about it, even aside from any potential god stuff, these two fruits, more so arguably than the Gum Gum fruit and the Dark fruit, are already the polar opposites of each other. Even the fruit's previous user, Whitebeard, despite being a good guy and a general ally to Luffy, was similarly the polar opposite of Luffy in many ways. Luffy is represented by the sun, Whitebeard was represented by the moon. Luffy seeks to sit upon the throne of Pirate King, while Whitebeard sought to stand ever before it. And just having these four be the four users of the four god fruits feels oddly balanced. Two good guys, two bad guys, one for every major faction in the One Piece world, one marine, one revolutionary, one good pirate, and one bad pirate. And if all four meet for the first time in the final war, which there's a good chance they will, then that could even explain the "and they will surely meet" line in the Harley, as the era of the Third World ends with the four gods mentioned throughout the rest of the Harley meeting, finally, for the first time. But this video isn't over yet. You see, there's one more thing I've yet to touch on. Like the four gods or the mermaid quintuplets named after them, there is another set of four characters, one of which is Sun God Nika, that this story has highlighted. I am of course referring to the four pictures in Emu's room, one of which is Luffy, who has the Sun God fruit, one of which is Blackbeard, who I've theorized to have the Earth God fruit, but the other two aren't Dragon and Green Bull, but rather Vivi and Shirahoshi. So whatever, right? Nothing to do with the four gods, except doesn't Vivi kind of have a massive connection to the rain? Her whole thing was making the rain fall in Alabasta to stop the war, to the point where it's even sort of implied that she literally made the rain fall at the end of the arc. Furthermore, the rain only stopped once Vivi fell asleep, almost like Vivi and the rain are spiritually connected. And doesn't Shirahoshi constantly talk about wanting to see a forest, like every time we catch up with her? Weird, right? What am I getting at here? Well, if these guys are the current users of the four gods devil fruits, then these guys are the four gods. Not literally, hell, maybe not even in a reincarnation sense. For all we know, these gods weren't ever even real and only existed in myth, but they at least, represent or embody the four gods in some way. Remember, Luffy already embodied the sun god prior to eating the sun god fruit. That's why the sun god fruit chose him to be its vessel over anyone else. And while we don't know what the characteristics of the other gods are, like we know Nika is about liberation and joy and imagination and so on, maybe this explains Vivi's affinity for the rain or Shirahoshi's affinity for forests, and well, Blackbeard's goal is kinda to become king of the world, or as a more literal translation from Japanese, king of the earth. And remember earlier how I made the link between the names of the gods and the things they were each the gods of, based off the respective ages of each of those things? Well, the same is true for the ages of the four gods here. Blackbeard, the earth god, is the oldest, Luffy the sun god is the second oldest, Vivi the rain god is the third oldest, and Shirahoshi the forest god is the fourth oldest. Ichika, Nika, Sanka, Yonka, the pattern holds up. There's also a possibility that Vivi and Shirahoshi also end up getting the storm and forest god fruits by the end of the series to complete the pattern, which would mean Dragon and Green Bull would have to die. Dragon dying specifically to Emu seems very likely for a number of reasons, but Green Bull, that could be why Oda made him the one out of the 5 admirals to be a purely evil piece of shit, as well as just introducing him so late because he plans to kill him off. Green Bull will probably fight Zoro, who has had a constant theme surrounding death. Maybe he'll kill Green Bull and use his soul to make a black blade, who the hell knows. But that's kind of it. I hope you enjoyed, yada yada, bye bye.